Then what Jesus did was he appointed apostles to write down his revelation. Look at Mark chapter 3. And this is how the New Testament is brought in. Mark chapter 3, verse 13. One of the things I love in the sense that it's so funny to me because it's so obvious that people don't really read the New Testament when you have all these liberals and a bunch of people saying, well, you know what? There's all kinds of different opinions after Jesus, was gone. There were all kinds of opinions about Jesus. There were opinions that Jesus was this way, was a man, and later at the Council of Nicaea, which is what the Da Vinci Code said, and all these different things, later they decided that Jesus was God. And what they're really saying is this: Jesus died and he didn't leave anybody to teach his truth accurately. Yet at the same time they say, oh, Jesus was one of the greatest religious leaders who ever lived. What kind of a religious leader doesn't leave his truth intact with people after him so they could be well taught? In fact, one of the regular activities at the time of the New Testament was to have philosophers who were teachers. You've heard in Acts the Epicureans, the Stoics. Well, they all come from teachers. And one of the things Paul would do is he would go into the marketplace and teach as a teacher. He taught in the school of Tyrannus. And there was teachers who had disciples, and those disciples would gather the teaching of the teacher and preserve it for generations. And that's what Jesus did. He appointed the 12 to be his special representatives of his truth and to give it to the world so that it would be done accurately. Look at Mark chapter 3, verse 13. And that's what it clearly says. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted. And Mark is very clear to explain to us that Jesus chose them. Not the early church, not generations later. He chose these particular men to be apostles because he wanted to. It was his choice. And they came to him, and he appointed 12, designating them apostles, so that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and have authority to drive out demons. And these are the 12 he appointed, and then he names them. Why do you think he named them? The reason? So we would know that these men, and only these men, were the apostles. Somebody says, I'm an apostle, and they get the revelation somewhere in a cave, and they come out, and they say that, and you say, hey, wait a minute. What's your name? Peter? Matthew? You see? These. And notice what he appointed them, that they might be with him. These were the credentials of these 12. They would be with him. For these years of his ministry, follow him around, listen to him. Some of them recorded what he said, which was a normal way that you did in that day of teachers, that he might then send them out to preach. What they wanted to preach? Their opinions? Of course not. What he said. And then to have authority to cast out demons and deal with Satan, which was so important. In the other Gospels, he also mentions that they were given the commission to heal the sick, which we know they did. To show that they were special. They had special revelation. Later in Acts chapter 1, when Judas was gone because God wanted 12 apostles to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, another apostle, Matthias, was appointed. And because God was going to draft in the Gentiles, because the 12 apostles were appointed specifically for the Jews, because God wanted to appoint to graft in the Gentiles, he grafted in one more apostle. His name was the Apostle Paul on the Damascus Road. And the Apostle Paul received his revelation from God, not from man, he said. He then went to the apostles. He had the right hand of fellowship. He laid his doctrine before them. He brought unity, and then there were 13, and that's it. Peter himself said in 2 Peter that Paul's letters were just like the rest of the Scriptures. And after that, the early church said, 13, no more. They were the ones that gave the revelation. And often people say, well, you know, there's all these people with different opinions about Jesus and stuff. How do you know you're right? You know what I say? Because my doctrine is the doctrine of the apostles of Jesus Christ. And the apostles of Jesus Christ wrote it down. And the reason that these books are in the New Testament is because either an apostle wrote it or a very close associate of an apostle. Not everybody's a writer. It's very well attested that Mark was a disciple of Peter, that the Christians at Rome begged Mark, please write down a gospel of what Peter said. Peter wasn't a writer. He barely got his 2 letters out. And he was a speaker. And I can attest to you, I've been doing a lot of writing. I would rather preach 1,000 sermons than write 1 book. It is so difficult to do. See? And takes so much time. Mark wrote it down. Luke was a close associate of the Apostle Paul. Was a doctor. Educated. He was a historian. Think of it just for a moment, because I love this. You have 4 Gospels. If you were to think what is the most logical way to portray Christ, the first thing you'd want to do is you need to show that Christ is predicted. And so God selected Matthew, who is, by the way, educated. He was a tax collector. You had to be educated. He was Jewish. And he gave us a portrait of Christ in all the Old Testament passages he fulfilled. Isn't that beautiful? You'd need at least, you would need somebody who had to write down Peter's if Peter didn't do it. Why? Peter was the chief apostle. Why did Peter get that big vision and then go to Cornelius to show that the Gentiles could receive the gospel apart from the law? It had to be Peter because Peter was so important. But Peter wasn't a writer, and so God selected Mark, a very close associate of Peter, to write it down. You need a historian. Somebody who's going to do all the investigative work. Somebody who's going to really do it, because a lot of the Gentiles who are going to be educated are going to come and say, hey, we want to see some investigation. And so he did. And even Luke says it in his prelude. Many have undertaken, but I am going to investigate it carefully and write down in order what happened. He went and interviewed Mary and then wrote down what Mary said. How else could he get all those details? She was still alive. And then you need somebody to write a gospel and give us some theology. All the things that Jesus said that is theologically rich. But it's got to be somebody who's spent some time as a Christian. I can tell you this, and you can too. When you've matured over time in the Scriptures, what happens is you have a perspective and you can look back and you will emphasize things that you never emphasized when you were a young Christian, and remember things that didn't seem as important that are now theologically rich. That's what John did. The one who sat with Jesus and who was loved by Jesus was at his breast, on his right side. John was the one that remembered all the things that Jesus said by the power of the Spirit, that talked about the Father and the Son. He gave the theological perspective because he could look back and see all those things in a rich way that only someone who could do it, who had been a long time as a Christian, was the last apostle alive. Incredible. Basically, the rest of the New Testament are the epistles of Peter, okay, the epistles of Paul, who were apostles, James, the brother of Jesus, you get any closer than that, who is one of the most important figures in the New Testament and in the early church, Jude, his brother, and the writer of Hebrews. And that's it. That's the whole New Testament. All close together, all within the apostolic church, all under the authority of the apostles, all part of that group. Brilliant plan? Of course it was. It was God's plan.